And then the big one that I almost didn't write down. Welcome, friends, to the first episode of Word of Jim Wednesdays. This is kind of my trial run for this, a pilot, if you will. And that's because I don't quite know what I'm doing with this. I went through like 4 different interviews in order to do this video, but a lot of them were about writing and Jim Butcher, like, just being charming and a normal human being with the people who were interviewing him. So there wasn't as much fun stuff as I would have thought, but I did pull out some pretty good ones, so stay tuned. Friends, in the first one that I watched, which was titled Jim Butcher Writes Women Well? ? By Between Two Perns, which is a very funny episode. Between Two Perns does the whole Between Two Ferns things where the person who's doing the interviewing is really rude on purpose to the interviewer. Some of these were probably Jim doing the whole like yes and thing that you do when you're doing improv or comedy of any sort where you don't know what's going on. But I did think that it was very funny that right from the bat the interviewer did forbid Jim from talking about the time that he skipped class to read in the library or how his creative writing professor, in order to prove her wrong, he wrote the first Dresden Files book doing like everything that she said to do, and it turned out to be a very good decision. And then the whole story about how Codex Alara is really Pokemon crossed with the Lost Roman Legion because some jerk on the internet bet him that he couldn't write a good story with that. He was allowed to do the Witch Doctor Curse story, but he didn't because it just wasn't relevant. But apparently Jim did stalk an agent that had dropped him at a convention and then demanded representation. I don't know if this was true or him just trying to like play along with the comedy going on, but that's kind of unhinged. At about 7 minutes and 48 seconds in, Jim Butcher said that Harry Dresden was who he'd like to think he'd be if he had that kind of power, but honestly, he'd just be a villain, laughing and giggling the entire time. Apparently, Stormfront originally was called Semi-Auto Magic, and then it was Abracadaver, but the people at the publishing house just really didn't like those. And apparently, all of the Dresden Files books had really punny names at first, but they were like, oh, that's too much like Terry Hatchett. And Jim Butcher was like, why is that a bad thing? But they eventually went out, and so that's why we have the titles we have today. At about 9 minutes and 7 seconds in, Jim Butcher talks about how Harry keeps trying to be a white knight to women because he doesn't like himself very much and has to make himself feel better. So I guess whatever works. And about 10 minutes and 28 seconds, there's a little skit where Jim Butcher plays God and James Marsters plays Harry, asking him very, very nicely to write a book where Harry doesn't get crapped on the entire time. And it's hilarious, and I really encourage you to go watch this interview because the entire thing is 20 minutes that is well worth your time. There's also a little bit about Bob the Skull asking Jim Butcher to write Romantasy for him, so maybe now y'all and your wives will have something to talk about. And apparently at 13 minutes and 50 seconds, Jim Butcher talks about how Bob was written because his teacher told him not to write talking head characters who are just there to explain something. And Jim Butcher definitely said that his creative process revolves around screw you, and this seemed like a very sincere answer. If Harry is kind of like a self-insert, like kind of halfway, it makes sense. Around 16 minutes, Jim Butcher does say that he prefers Book 7, Deadbeat, as the entry point for new people into the Dresden Files series, and he did tease a new TV show for the Dresden Files series, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So in the next interview, which is Jim Butcher talks to Dresden Files, Star Wars, and more at Dragon Con Fandom Spotlight 2024, he talks about why wizards are named Harry, and that's because there's a couple famous wizards that are named Harry. It's not after Harry Potter. He started writing Dresden Files before Harry Potter was a thing and then was freaking out when it became super big, but realized that once a couple years had passed, all the kids that read Harry Potter would be teenagers who wanted to read something edgier. And so Harry Dresden would fill in that gap. Apparently, Adam Baldwin from Firefly and Chuck was the runner-up to play Dresden in the TV show, and they talk about this around 10 minutes and 28 seconds in. This interview was done, obviously, like a year before the Between Two Perns interview was, and apparently the rights to the Dresden Files TV show has changed hands multiple times. There's definitely interest in making it, it just hasn't been done yet. But Jim did make a wisecrack in the Between Two Perns interview that makes me think that we might be a little bit closer to getting a Dresden Files TV series reboot that's done the right way this time in the nearest future. Also, 12 months is hard to write because it's going to be very intentionally focused on Harry's internal dialogue, like how do you deal with everything that happened in Battleground emotionally. It's also hard to write because it took place over the course of a year, And usually a Dresden Files book is just like the worst weekend of Harry's life that year. Moving on to a quick 2-minute video I saw how James Marsters got the job of recording Jim Butcher's audiobooks. According to Marsters, Jim Butcher decided that he should read the audiobooks, though Jim Butcher said in other interviews that I need to find that his people picked James Marsters and he was just super happy about it because he was a Buffy fan. And then Marsters talks about how the work you do with your voice as a stage actor is a really good foundation for what you have to do to tell a story as an audiobook narrator. And also that the staff at the audiobook company was really surprised that he came back after lunch and didn't just call his agent and quit, which I thought was adorable. Next, on the Tiki Man and Viking podcast, this was part 1 of their interview with Jim Butcher, and I think this has the best stuff. So, Stormfront was the 8th book that Jim Butcher ever wrote. The first 7 were terrible. We're probably not going to get an appearance by the Jade Court because they're very isolationist. I think a lot of people already knew that. And then the big one that I almost didn't write down, but I think that is super important. So, when asked if it was hard to keep everything straight with working on multiple books at once, Jim Butcher says that his beta readers really help him keep on track. One example that he gave was that in book 3, chapter 12, he said something completely opposite to the new book that he was writing, i.e. 12 months. Now, me being the person I am and this being the channel that it is, I found my copy of Grave Peril, which is book 3, on my Audible account because I don't have a physical or ebook copy of that. And I realized it was 17 minutes long, so I listened. This is the chapter in Grave Peril where Dresden goes to Mickey Malone's house to visit him and his wife has to invite him in. Now this is the cop that got possessed by Kravos and was really scaring all the normies. Basically when Harry tries to get in, Rudolph is there and gives him crap for it. Rudolph is like, what are you, Count Dracula and have to be invited in? And then Harry has this throwaway line where he's like, Drakul has been in Eastern Europe for the most of the recent future, as long as we've been tracking him, which means that probably somebody in the White Council is keeping an eye on Drakul. And he just came into play in Battleground. Remember when we lost Chandler and the other, I'm forgetting her name right now, but I think she's related to Shiro, the other warden, where they basically kidnapped them and decided that they were going to be Black Court vampires from now on. Another thing that I found on the internet is that Chandler apparently is good with whatever the legal version of time magic is, which might play into the whole mirror stuff. But comment down below if I'm getting that wrong or mixed up with something. So basically Drakul's location as early as Grave Peril is something that's being called into question now, or something that Jim Butcher's having to make sure that he gets right in a later book. He also talks about how thresholds work and why they kind of disable vampires and make it very hard for them to survive in places where they're not welcome, and why it basically makes his power not work if he goes somewhere that he's not invited in first. That could be another thing, but it seems very, very general at this point. He did have a conversation with Stallings where he talked about people disappearing off the streets, and Harry thinks maybe this is Bianca looking for hors d'oeuvres, but he doesn't want to tell Stallings that because apparently once things start to get bad, you start scaring people and they start burning everything in sight, no matter who is right or wrong. That's kind of a reference to what Harry's going to do later on in the book. And around the 14-minute mark, Jim Butcher does talk about how writing the Dresden Files books later in the series is much easier because his fans made a Wikipedia for it. And that makes me feel like a little bit better for making these videos where I just completely dissect things that have gone on in the Dresden Files series, because he said that he does change things and doesn't like people trying to figure out things before they happen. Maybe if I ever go to Dragon Con or something, he won't kick me out. All right, this was the first Word of Jim Wednesday. I think I kind of failed here on finding the good stuff, but I think if I go through some longer interviews, I might find some more hints that get dropped for future books. Let me know in the comments down below, and if you think that I should just stick to the super well thought out theory videos, also tell me that.